Richmond, California, December 1942. The air was thick with smoke and molten sparks. The night sky pulsed orange from the glow of floodlights as thousands of workers swarmed across the docks. Cranes swung like iron giants, chains groaned, and molten steel hissed into shape. Every hour mattered, every hand was a weapon. On the edge of the shipyard, a man in oil-stained overalls stood over a massive steel frame, its bow not yet welded, its stern barely riveted. He wasn't a naval officer, not even a trained shipbuilder. Yet, the blueprint rolled in his calloused hands carried an idea so radical that it had been laughed out of boardrooms and banned by old guard engineers. He believed a ship could be built like a car, in parts, in rhythm, in days instead of months. The papers called it madness. The Navy called it impossible. But tonight, the impossible was glowing under the welding torches. By dawn, the shape of a Liberty ship, the vessel that would change the war, began to rise from the dust and steel. And one man's forbidden blueprint was about to rewrite the speed of victory itself. The year was 1940, and the Atlantic Ocean had turned into a graveyard. Beneath its cold grey waves, German U-boats stalked Allied convoys with silent precision. Each night, their periscopes rose like the eyes of sharks hunting their prey, merchant ships carrying food, weapons, and hope to Britain. By the summer of 1941, the situation was desperate. Britain was losing one ship every 7 hours. Convoys burned in the night, black smoke staining the sky from Halifax to Liverpool. The sea lanes, once the arteries of the free world, were bleeding out. Winston Churchill, in one of his darker moments, confessed that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever really frightened me. He wasn't exaggerating. Without supplies from across the Atlantic, Britain would starve within months. Every torpedoed freighter meant fewer tanks in the desert, fewer shells in Russia, fewer rations for the home front. The Allies needed ships. Thousands of them. But shipyards were slow, bound by traditions from another century. Each vessel was handcrafted, plates riveted by teams working for months. A standard cargo ship took nearly a year to complete. The math was cruelly simple. The Axis could sink them faster than the Allies could build them. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it inherited not just the fight, but the crisis of production. Washington's answer was bold: an emergency shipbuilding program, a nationwide mobilization to flood the oceans with new cargo ships. Yet there was a problem. The U.S. Maritime Commission, while ambitious, was still bound by conservative naval thinking. Their first mass production model, the Liberty ship, was a modified British design, reliable, yes, but slow to build and outdated before it even launched. The shipyards assigned to construct them were traditionalists, men who trusted rivets over welds, craftsmanship over speed, and blueprints over imagination. But war does not wait for tradition. By 1942, German U-boats were sinking ships faster than ever. Over 6 million tons of Allied shipping had vanished into the Atlantic. The home front felt the tension. Newspapers reported the losses in code, and rationing tightened its grip. Factories were producing tanks and planes in record numbers. Yet those weapons sat idle without ships to carry them. America's greatest strength was its industry, but even that was chained to old methods. Shipyards, scattered along both coasts, were operating at their limits. Welding was seen as dangerous and untested for ocean-going vessels. Prefabrication, assembling ships from pre-made sections, was dismissed as unworkable. Every innovation that could save time was met with resistance. And then came a man who wasn't supposed to be there at all. He wasn't a naval engineer or a shipwright. He was a builder of roads, dams, and dreams, a self-made construction magnate named Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser had built America's great projects: the Hoover Dam, the Grand Gully, the pipelines that tamed deserts. He understood the language of logistics, not blueprints. He knew that victory would not be decided by design, but by speed. When he looked at the shipyards, he didn't see a dock, he saw an assembly line. To him, a ship was just another massive structure waiting to be modularized. Where others saw impossibility, he saw inefficiency. In 1941, Kaiser approached the U.S. Maritime Commission with an audacious idea. He could build ships in half the time, at half the cost, if only they let him do it his way. His way, however, broke every rule. He wanted to weld ships instead of riveting them. He wanted to prefabricate sections on land, then move them into place like puzzle pieces. He wanted to use workers who had never set foot in a shipyard, women, farmers, mechanics, trained not in years, but in weeks. To the old guard, it was lunacy. To Henry Kaiser, it was the only way to win. That belief, stubborn, radical, and forbidden, was about to collide head-on with America's wartime bureaucracy. And in the smoke of that collision, the future of shipbuilding would be forged. These stories aren't just history, they're proof of human courage and sacrifice. If you too salute these heroes, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and become a part of our journey. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Let's continue the story. Henry J. Kaiser was not born into shipbuilding, he built himself from dust. By the 1930s, he was already a legend of American infrastructure. His companies had poured the concrete of the Hoover Dam, carved highways through the Sierra Nevada, and raised entire cities from wilderness. Kaiser was not an engineer in the academic sense. He was a builder who saw time as the true measure of success. Every day saved meant progress. Every delay was a failure. So when the war came, and the government needed ships faster than humanly possible, Kaiser saw it as an engineering problem, not of steel, but of organization. The established shipbuilders, Bath Iron Works, Newport News, Bethlehem Steel, were powerful, traditional, and territorial. Their methods dated back to World War I, painstaking craftsmanship, expert riveters, and long timelines. Each ship was a work of art, not a product. To Kaiser, that mindset was the enemy. He looked at how Henry Ford had turned cars into an assembly line miracle. Why couldn't ships be built the same way, modular, standardized, and mass-produced? But the U.S. Maritime Commission was skeptical. They needed reliability, not experiments. Naval architects scoffed at his proposal. One commissioner reportedly called Kaiser's plan industrial heresy. Prefabricated hull sections, welded together like parts of a bridge, sounded reckless. Welding was feared. It could crack under stress, warp under heat, and fail at sea. Riveting was slower, but trusted. Still, the crisis deepened. Ship losses mounted. There was no time for caution. So, reluctantly, the government handed Kaiser a contract, not for ships, but for a shipyard. He would build it from nothing. A patch of empty land in Richmond, California, an old waterfront with no cranes, no dry docks, no workforce. He promised to make it the fastest shipyard in America. And he did. In less than 6 months, Richmond Shipyard No. 1 rose like a fortress of steel and flame. By the end of 1941, more than 20,000 workers were on site, many of them women, immigrants, and people of color. They came from every corner of America, drawn by the promise of work and the call of war. Kaiser's genius was not in ship design, but in human design. He reorganized production into a rhythm, prefabrication yards, section assembly lines, mobile cranes that could lift pre-built hull blocks directly into place. Every worker had a role. Every role was part of a system. He didn't care about pedigree, only precision. A woman who had never held a wrench could become a certified welder within weeks. A farmer who once repaired tractors could now assemble the backbone of a ship. Kaiser created an industrial ecosystem where time itself was weaponized. And it worked. His first Liberty ships rolled out faster than anyone thought possible. 45 days, then 30, then 20. Newspapers couldn't believe it. Rival shipbuilders whispered that it was a publicity stunt. But the ships sailed, and they sailed strong. Still, the traditional engineers resisted. They said his methods were dangerous, that welds would fail under Atlantic storms, that mass production would lower quality. Kaiser pushed back with data, not words. Every ship was inspected, every weld tested under pressure. The results silenced critics one by one. Behind closed doors, however, his real ambition grew bolder. He wanted to build ships not just faster, but unimaginably faster. He dreamed of cutting the time from months to days. A goal so absurd that even his allies called it forbidden. But Kaiser didn't flinch. He poured money into new cranes, night shifts, and mobile workshops. His shipyards became cities within cities, complete with hospitals, cafeterias, and even child care centers for his workers. Productivity soared. The press began calling him the miracle man of shipbuilding. By late 1942, as Allied convoys regained strength, the world began to notice. Each new Liberty ship that launched was not just a vessel, it was a statement. Industrial might could be as decisive as any weapon. But Kaiser wasn't done. He wanted a new class of ship, faster, stronger, more efficient than the Liberty. The next evolution. The victory ship. And to prove his blueprint truly worked, he would attempt something no one had ever dared before, to build a ship from keel to launch in less than a week. The challenge was set. The world was watching. And the line between madness and genius was about to blur under the sparks of Richmond's welding torches. 1. The human angle, the army of civilians. The Richmond Shipyards never slept. Day and night, they thundered with the rhythm of hammers, cranes, and human resolve. What Henry Kaiser built was not just a factory, it was a city of labor, alive with determination. By 1943, his shipyards employed over 90,000 workers, many of whom had never seen the sea before. They came from farms, small towns, and city streets. Women left kitchens and offices. Men too old for combat found new uniforms in coveralls and helmets. African American, Mexican, Chinese, and white workers stood side by side, rare in wartime America, united not by ideology, but by necessity. Every face carried its own story. Mothers became welders. Grandfathers became crane operators. Teenagers learned to torch steel in weeks. Kaiser believed in giving everyone a chance, what he called the democracy of labor. He set up schools inside the yards to train anyone willing to learn. His philosophy was simple: give me a person who wants to work, and I'll make them an expert. The result was unprecedented. These untrained civilians transformed into one of the most efficient workforces in history. They welded hulls through fog, wind, and exhaustion, knowing that every finished ship meant another convoy protected, another soldier supplied. The war had turned them into industrial warriors. And Kaiser gave them armor in the form of innovation, better lighting, safety rules, and, for the first time in American industry, on-site medical care and child care centers. At the Richmond yards, Rosie the Riveter wasn't a slogan. She was a neighbor, a friend, a mother. The shipyards became symbols of what America could achieve when everyone had a part to play. The noise of machinery became the heartbeat of a new kind of warfare, one fought not with rifles, but with wrenches and welders' torches. Each Liberty ship that slid into the bay carried their fingerprints, their sweat, their pride. And as Kaiser often said, every ship launched here is a blow struck for freedom. 2. The industrial angle, turning the shipyard into a factory. Traditional shipbuilding was an art, slow, methodical, and built by craftsmen who treated every hull as a masterpiece. Kaiser's revolution stripped away that tradition and replaced it with something colder, but infinitely faster. He reorganized the process the way Ford built cars, breaking down every ship into modules or prefabricated sections. Instead of one shipyard building a vessel from keel to mast, multiple shops built pieces simultaneously. One fabricated the bow, another the midsection, another the stern, each a self-contained assembly line. When complete, these massive sections, sometimes weighing hundreds of tons, were transported by crane and fitted together with astonishing precision. Welding replaced thousands of rivets, saving both time and material. For the first time in maritime history, a cargo ship could be built the same way one might assemble an airplane. It wasn't art. It was rhythm. Every motion, every weld, every lift was timed. Crews moved with the discipline of clockwork. And because each section was pre-tested and standardized, the margin for error shrank dramatically. This method not only cut construction time but changed how America thought about manufacturing. It proved that scale could beat specialization, that quantity, when done smartly, was quality. Of course, there were setbacks. Early welded ships sometimes cracked under strain, earning them grim nicknames like Kaiser's coffins. But Kaiser's engineers attacked each failure scientifically, reinforcing seams, adjusting alloys, and redesigning joints. Soon, the cracks stopped, and the system began to sing. By mid-1943, Kaiser shipyards were producing a Liberty ship every 10 days on average. Other yards began copying his methods. The forbidden blueprint, once mocked, became a national template. Kaiser's empire of efficiency stretched from California to Oregon to Maine. He built shipyards faster than most companies could build factories. And each one followed the same rulebook: speed was salvation. The Richmond yards became a symbol of industrial will, vast forests of cranes, echoing with the clatter of chains and the flash of arcs. Every completed ship that hit the water was a direct answer to the U-boats prowling the Atlantic. But beneath the steel and smoke, there was a growing tension, a clash between the new world of mechanized building and the old guard of naval tradition. And as Kaiser's methods grew bolder, that tension was about to reach its breaking point. 3. The technological angle, the science of speed. At the center of Kaiser's forbidden blueprint was a simple idea: build ships the way nature builds bones, from units that fit perfectly together. To his engineers, it meant reimagining a vessel as a collection of parts, not a monolithic hull. Traditional shipbuilders worked from the keel upward, laying plates one by one, riveting each piece manually. The process was reliable, but glacial. Kaiser's approach was the opposite: construct large, complete sections on land, sometimes entire decks or bulkheads, and weld them together with massive cranes. This idea of modular prefabrication wasn't new in theory, but no one had dared apply it to ships of this size and urgency. The challenge was precision. If even a fraction of an inch was off, the sections would not align. Kaiser's solution was to industrialize accuracy itself. He brought in engineers from the automotive and bridge industries, men who thought in measurements of mass production, not craftsmanship. Jigs and templates ensured each section was built identically. Steel plates were cut with mechanized torches instead of hammers. Subassemblies were tested and pre-painted before joining. Most radically, Kaiser abandoned the ancient art of riveting. Instead, he embraced welding, a process faster, cheaper, and, when done right, stronger. A skilled riveter could secure 500 rivets a day. A welder could fuse 5,000 inches of steel in the same time. Welding changed everything. It reduced ship weight by hundreds of tons, improved fuel efficiency, and eliminated the labor bottleneck of rivet crews. But it also terrified the establishment. Naval engineers had trusted rivets since the age of steam. Welding, they argued, made steel brittle, vulnerable to cold seas and high pressure. Early Liberty ships did suffer cracks, sometimes catastrophic ones, due to welding errors or low-grade steel. Kaiser responded not with retreat, but innovation. He formed one of the first large-scale metallurgical testing divisions in wartime industry. Every failure became a study. Every crack, a lesson. Metallurgists adjusted alloys, introduced heat treating, and improved welding sequences. Soon, the failures stopped, and the U.S. Navy quietly began adopting his methods. Kaiser had proven that speed and strength could coexist. In a war where time meant lives, the stopwatch had become as important as the blueprint. 4. The resistance angle, the war within the war. Yet, for all his success, Henry Kaiser was still viewed by many as an outsider, a civilian meddler in a world of admirals and engineers. His meteoric rise, his publicity, and his audacity made him a target. Inside the Maritime Commission, skeptics dismissed him as a showman. Traditional yards resented his popularity, especially after headlines celebrated each record ship. They argued that his assembly-line navy risked quality for quantity, that the obsession with speed endangered sailors. The Bureau of Ships, the Navy's engineering authority, repeatedly warned against expanding his methods. Kaiser's blueprints, they said, violated safety protocols. Prefabrication on such scale was structurally unproven. In bureaucratic language, that was a polite way of saying, forbidden. But Kaiser had a weapon the bureaucrats lacked: results. When the Liberty ship SS Patrick Henry was completed in record time and sailed flawlessly, the press hailed it as the ship heard round the world. Then came another, and another. Still, the skepticism persisted. Many naval engineers were career men who had spent decades mastering their craft. To see an industrial outsider defy centuries of tradition was an affront. Riveting crews, long considered elite, now found their skills obsolete. Foremen who once led with pride were retrained as production supervisors, the age of the craftsman giving way to the age of the factory. In a quiet way, the shipyard became a battlefield of its own, not between nations, but between eras. Kaiser was undeterred. He argued that democracy itself required speed, that every day lost to bureaucracy was a convoy sunk, a soldier starved, a life wasted. When critics labeled his methods reckless, he simply pointed to the Atlantic. Ships were burning there. His were not. As 1942 turned to 1943, his forbidden blueprint was no longer just an experiment. It was the foundation of a revolution. And yet, he still hadn't proven the full extent of what it could do. To silence his doubters once and for all, he proposed one final test. He would build a full-sized Liberty ship, from the laying of the keel to the launch, in under 5 days. It would be a feat the world would call impossible. And that was exactly why Henry Kaiser would attempt it. December 8, 1942, Richmond Shipyard No. 2. The winter sun hung low over San Francisco Bay, its light cutting through the haze of steam and welding smoke. The air was electric with tension. This wasn't just another day of shipbuilding, this was a race against the impossible. At 12:01 a.m., a whistle blew. Sparks erupted, cranes groaned, and the first steel plates of a new Liberty ship were lowered into place. Its name was already chosen, SS Robert E. Peary, but what it would represent was far greater than its name. Kaiser had promised to build it in less than 5 days. To the old engineers, that sounded like madness. To the thousands of workers watching, it sounded like a challenge. Every shipyard in the nation was listening. Newspapers had sent reporters. Naval officers stood silently with clipboards, skeptical but curious. A single failure, a crack, a delay, a misaligned section, would humiliate the man who had dared to outthink a century of tradition. But Henry Kaiser wasn't thinking about pride. He was thinking about proof. He knew that if his methods could produce a seaworthy vessel at this speed, it would silence every critic and reshape wartime industry forever. From the first hour, The Richmond yard transformed into something almost otherworldly, a choreography of steel. Prefabricated sections, already completed in nearby workshops, arrived on railcars in precise sequence. Cranes swung them into place with only inches to spare. Welders moved like dancers, arcs flashing white in the fog. Shift whistles marked time like drumbeats. Every man and woman in the yard understood the stakes. Day 1, the keel was laid, the backbone aligned. Day 2, the sides and bulkheads rose from the ground like ribs. Day 3, the deckhouses were welded, the cranes swinging in a blur of steel and sparks. By Day 4, crowds had gathered outside the gates. Newsreel cameras rolled. Some said it was a stunt, others whispered it was history. Workers slept on cots beside the hull, eating hurried meals between shifts. Every torch burned through the night, and the yard glowed like a forge. At dawn on December 12th, less than 5 days after the whistle first sounded, the ship stood complete, 441 feet of welded steel, gleaming with frost and pride. The workers had done it in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. When the final weld cooled, the crowd erupted. Flags unfurled, whistles screamed across the bay, and the Robert E. Peary slid down the ways into the cold waters of Richmond Harbor. It was not just a launch, it was a declaration. Newspapers called it the ship that defied time. Reporters wrote that America had found its rhythm. Even President Roosevelt was briefed personally, astonished by the numbers, intrigued by the implications. Naval inspectors combed through every joint, every weld, every plate. The verdict came back clear: the ship was sound. It passed all sea trials. It was, by every measure, a success. The impossible had been proven possible. For the shipbuilders watching around the country, the message was unmistakable: the old ways were gone. Prefabrication, welding, modular construction, once considered reckless, were now the new gospel of industrial warfare. The Robert E. Peary became a legend, her name etched into wartime mythology. Though her mission was simple, to carry supplies across the Atlantic, her legacy was monumental. She represented the moment when human organization triumphed over human limitation. Henry Kaiser himself stood at the dock, coat collar turned up against the winter wind, watching the ship vanish into the mist. He didn't celebrate loudly. He didn't need to. The noise of the yard said it all: 90,000 workers cheering not for one man, but for proof that what they'd built mattered. That night, telegrams poured in from shipyards across America. Congratulations, disbelief, and, from a few rivals, grudging respect. The term Kaiser's miracle began to circulate in the press. But Kaiser knew this was just the beginning. Because even as the Robert E. Peary sailed, the Navy wanted more, faster, larger, stronger ships that could withstand the Atlantic gales and carry heavier loads. The next step was already on his drawing board: a new design called the Victory ship, capable of greater speed, endurance, and production efficiency. The age of the Liberty ship was ending. The age of the Victory ship was about to begin. And with it, Henry Kaiser's forbidden blueprint would leave the realm of experiment and become the industrial weapon that helped win the war. The launch of the SS Robert E. Peary echoed far beyond the fog of San Francisco Bay. Within hours, the story reached Washington. Headlines blazed across the country. Ship in 5 days. Kaiser breaks all records. A new kind of war production. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had long believed in America's industrial potential, received the report with astonishment. In his wartime briefings, the numbers were clear. The ship had gone from keel to launch in less than 5 days, and it was seaworthy. This, he said, according to naval aides, is what will win the war. To the public, it was a symbol of hope. To the military, it was a revolution. To the enemy, it was a warning. The strategic shock. Across the Atlantic, in occupied France, German naval intelligence analyzed the reports with disbelief. If the numbers were accurate, and they were, it meant the Allies could now replace ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had once seemed unwinnable, was beginning to tilt. For years, Admiral Karl Donit's U-boat fleet had operated on a grim arithmetic: sink ships faster than the Allies could build them. That calculation had now shattered. By early 1943, thanks to the Liberty and emerging Victory ship programs, the Allies were launching vessels faster than the Kriegsmarine could destroy them. The Atlantic Lifeline, the artery connecting American factories to British ports, was healing. The wolf pack still prowled, but their prey was multiplying. Each new Liberty ship was more than steel. It was a floating statement that industry had turned the tide. Washington responds. In Washington, Kaiser's triumph sparked both admiration and alarm. Admiration, because the results were undeniable. Alarm, because his methods, if uncontrolled, threatened to upend established hierarchies. The U.S. Maritime Commission moved quickly to formalize his techniques. New contracts spread the Kaiser model to shipyards across the nation: Portland, Vancouver, South Portland, Wilmington. Dozens of new yards began applying prefabrication and welding at scale. Yet, behind the scenes, some Navy officials bristled. They feared that the obsession with speed would sacrifice safety. They pointed to the rare but real incidents of brittle fractures in welded ships during Arctic voyages. Kaiser's metallurgists worked tirelessly to address them, while the Navy grudgingly admitted that even with occasional issues, his ships kept the supply lines alive. The statistics silenced the debate. By 1943, Kaiser's yards alone were producing more than one Liberty ship every day. Nationally, the U.S. would complete 2,710 Liberty ships by war's end, most of them built with techniques pioneered in Richmond. But Kaiser was already thinking beyond Liberty. Birth of the Victory ship. The Liberty ships had been built fast, but they were slow, only about 11 knots at cruising speed. That was fine in 1942, but as the war evolved, the Navy demanded faster convoys to outpace submarines and deliver troops to the Pacific. Kaiser's team, working with the Maritime Commission and naval architects, began designing a new class, the Victory ship. It was longer, sleeker, and more powerful. Instead of steam reciprocating engines, it used efficient steam turbines. Its top speed doubled the Liberty's, reaching 17 knots. More importantly, it was designed from the ground up for mass production, every lesson from the Robert E. Peary distilled into one hull. Prefabrication wasn't experimental anymore. It was doctrine. When the first Victory ship, the SS United Victory, launched in January 1944, she represented the peak of Kaiser's philosophy: fast to build, strong at sea, and beautiful in her simplicity. The government awarded contracts for hundreds more. Richmond became the central node of this effort, 4 shipyards operating 24 hours a day, each turning out a Victory ship every 10 days. It was a rhythm of war industry unlike anything in history. The industrial war machine. Kaiser's achievement went beyond ships. It altered how America thought about warfare itself. Factories began mirroring shipyards. Prefabrication in aircraft, tanks, and weapons became standard. The assembly line was no longer a peacetime innovation. It was a weapon of survival. Time, as Kaiser had always said, was the true battlefield. And now, America was winning that battle decisively. The human reaction. For the workers at Richmond, the Peary's record-breaking launch was a moment of validation. It proved that ordinary people, welders, mothers, farmhands, could do extraordinary things when organized toward a common goal. Newspapers printed their photos, calling them heroes without rifles. Even rival shipbuilders began sending delegations to learn Kaiser's methods firsthand. What they found was not secret technology, but discipline, planning, and belief. Henry Kaiser himself remained humble. "I didn't build these ships," he told reporters. "America did." Still, he knew what he'd unleashed, a new industrial paradigm. The lesson spread through every corridor of government. Innovation was not just invention, it was the courage to break old rules. By mid-1944, when victory ships began crossing the Pacific and Atlantic in endless convoys, even the skeptics conceded. The forbidden blueprint had become standard operating procedure. Henry Kaiser's name, once dismissed in boardrooms, was now spoken in the same breath as Ford, Edison, and Roosevelt. The miracle of the Robert E. Peary had proven one truth, that in total war, the speed of production was the speed of victory. And while the headlines faded and the cameras turned elsewhere, Kaiser's vision continued to build ships months and years after that December dawn. What began as an experiment had become the backbone of Allied logistics, the hidden fleet behind every victory at sea. By early 1944, the statistics told a story even the most hardened generals couldn't ignore. American shipyards, powered by Kaiser's methods, had transformed the Allied logistics map. In less than 3 years, over 2,000 Liberty ships and hundreds of Victory ships had joined the convoys. For the first time since the start of the war, the Atlantic wasn't bleeding tonnage. It was replenishing it. The numbers that won the war. At the peak of production, Kaiser's yards launched a new ship every 4.5 days. Across the nation, the collective output of U.S. shipbuilders reached 8 million tons of cargo capacity per year, an industrial scale no empire in history had ever achieved. Each ship carried roughly 10,000 tons of supplies, enough food, tanks, and ammunition to sustain a full division across oceans. Multiply that by thousands of voyages, and the math became staggering. Every invasion, from North Africa to Normandy to the Philippines, was carried on the backs of these vessels. Without them, no landing craft could be fueled, no soldier fed, no tank repaired. The Liberty ship became the backbone of global transport, the bridge that connected the factories of Detroit to the beaches of Europe. And it all traced back to one principle: modular speed. The hidden front. Military historians would later call it the second front of production. While soldiers fought across continents, America waged a quieter, relentless war in steel and labor. At Kaiser's Richmond yards, shifts never ended. Spotlights kept the docks bright through the night. Loudspeakers blared messages of encouragement and swing music. At lunch breaks, the sounds of welding mixed with laughter and song. Posters lined the walls: "Ships will win the war, men and women will build them." They weren't just slogans. They were truth. The shipyard's workforce had reached more than 90,000 people, including 25,000 women, among the highest female employment rates of any industrial site in the war. Many were single mothers, working 12-hour shifts, supported by Kaiser's unheard-of innovations: on-site daycare, medical clinics, and even health insurance. This system, dubbed Kaiser Health, would later evolve into the Kaiser Permanent Medical Network, one of America's first large-scale healthcare systems. It was a direct byproduct of wartime necessity and compassion. For Kaiser, the human engine mattered as much as the steel one. He understood that a healthy, motivated worker built faster, stronger ships. The U.S. government took notice. By 1944, reports from the War Production Board used Richmond as the model for total labor mobilization. Other industries followed suit. Aircraft, tank, and ammunition plants copied Kaiser's welfare and efficiency programs. Industrial warfare had been redefined not just by machines, but by people. The Atlantic turns. While the Richmond yards pulsed with activity, across the ocean, the effects were being felt in deadly contrast. The U-boat war, once Germany's pride, began to collapse under sheer arithmetic. In 1942, German submarines had sunk over 1,000 Allied ships. By 1944, that number had fallen to less than 100. Every convoy now sailed faster, denser, and better protected. For every ship the U-boats claimed, 10 more replaced it. German Admiral Donitz later admitted in post-war interviews, "We could no longer sink ships faster than they could build them." That was the end. The statement summarized the war's economic truth. Naval superiority no longer belonged to those with the largest fleet, but to those who could replace losses the quickest. Global recognition. By the war's final year, Henry Kaiser had become a household name. Time magazine dubbed him the miracle shipbuilder. President Roosevelt personally thanked him, citing his work as a decisive contribution to Allied victory. Yet Kaiser remained restless. He had already begun plans for the post-war future: shipbuilding for commerce, affordable housing for veterans, and an expansion of his healthcare system for peace. The press followed him everywhere, eager to capture the man who had turned blueprints into a national arsenal. But when asked about his greatest accomplishment, Kaiser simply said, "It wasn't the ships. It was the people who learned they could build the impossible." His legacy was already sailing the world's oceans, not just in steel hulls, but in the new global supply lines that would define the post-war age. The Liberty and Victory ships had done more than win a war. They had set the foundation for a connected planet. The war was ending, but Kaiser's revolution had only just begun. His shipyards would soon face peace, and the question of what to build next. The war ended not with the thunder of shipyards, but with their silence. In August 1945, as Japan surrendered and the world exhaled, the forges of Richmond slowly dimmed. The clanging of steel faded into the memory of victory. For the first time in years, the shipwrights of Kaiser's empire laid down their torches. But the fleet they had built still roamed the seas, thousands of Liberty and Victory ships carrying not weapons now, but wheat, coal, and hope. From warships to lifelines. The transformation was immediate. The very ships that had ferried troops and tanks now became the vessels of recovery. Under the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, Liberty ships delivered food to war-torn Europe, carried medicine to Asia, and brought refugees to new homelands. In 1946 alone, hundreds of these ships formed the backbone of the Marshall Plan, transporting the materials that would rebuild cities from Hamburg to Hiroshima. To the sailors who served aboard them, the transition felt symbolic. Once instruments of war, the same decks now bore the cargo of renewal. Some of these ships sailed under new flags, sold to Allied nations rebuilding their own merchant fleets. Others were repurposed as hospital ships, training vessels, or civilian freighters. The Liberty ship, once a symbol of desperate wartime speed, became a global workhorse of peace. The industrial echo. Yet, perhaps the deeper legacy was not in the ships themselves, but in the system that created them. Kaiser's prefabrication and labor management principles became templates for a new generation of industries. Airplane factories, automobile plants, even the rising field of prefabricated housing borrowed directly from his methods. In Detroit, Henry Ford's engineers quietly studied Kaiser's shipyard efficiency reports, admiring how his teams had achieved car-like production in a field once ruled by artisanal labor. In Japan, decades later, Toyota would refine similar ideas into its famed just-in-time system, a direct descendant of the wartime philosophy that no second, no motion should be wasted. Kaiser had shown that organization itself could be a weapon, and later a tool for prosperity. The human legacy. But Kaiser's influence extended beyond steel and schedules. His innovations in worker welfare, healthcare, childcare, safety reshaped the American labor landscape. The medical plan he'd launched to care for his shipbuilders became Kaiser Permanent, a model for integrated health systems still serving millions today. His on-site daycare centers became early case studies in women's workforce participation. His belief that every worker was a partner in production inspired corporate cultures for decades to come. To historians, this was the hidden triumph of his war effort, Not just ships built faster, but people treated better. And for the thousands who had once stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the roar of the cranes, the experience left a lasting mark. Many continued in post-war shipbuilding or industrial design. Others carried those lessons home: discipline, teamwork, the unspoken pride of having built something that mattered. For many women, those years at the shipyards had opened a door that would never again close. They had proven their strength on the industrial front, and though most were pushed out when peace returned, the precedent had been set. The seeds of future movements for equality had been welded in steel on the Richmond waterfront. The fate of the ships. Time, however, is ruthless even to legends. Many Liberty ships were scrapped by the 1960s, their steel recycled into new generations of freighters, bridges, and rail lines. A few survived, preserved as floating museums, their riveted hulls a reminder of the hands that built them. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, for example, still sails from San Francisco, one of only 2 operational Liberty ships left in the world. Her decks echo faintly with the hammering ghosts of Richmond, a living testament to Henry Kaiser's vision. Each time she departs the harbor, the same thought lingers: this was the ship that changed the tempo of war. The final numbers. By the end of 1945, Kaiser shipyards had produced 1,490 Liberty ships, 141 Victory ships, and countless other auxiliary vessels. Combined with other yards following his methods, America had built over 5,500 ocean-going ships in less than 4 years. No nation, before or since, has matched that scale or speed. And the ripple of that achievement continued to shape global logistics, commercial shipping, and military supply for generations. The cranes would rust, the docks would fall silent, but the blueprint remained, the forbidden idea that changed the nature of creation itself, that the impossible can be built not through genius alone, but through coordination, courage, and faith in the ordinary worker. The war was over. But Henry Kaiser's revolution had only just begun. History remembers the explosions, the battles, the victories, the heroes with medals on their chests. But sometimes, the true turning points happen in silence, in the echo of a hammer, the hiss of a welder's torch, the rhythm of unseen hands working through the night. Henry Kaiser never commanded a fleet. He never wore a uniform. Yet his revolution in steel and time did what entire armies could not. It made endurance possible. In a war defined by destruction, he built. And in doing so, he proved that industry itself could become a form of courage. The blueprint they once called forbidden was more than a plan, it was a philosophy. That speed and precision, when guided by human compassion and organization, could be more powerful than any weapon. Every Liberty ship that slid into the sea carried that belief. Each one was a fragment of a larger idea, that human ingenuity, multiplied by will, could alter the course of history. Even today, the ghost of that lesson lingers wherever efficiency meets purpose, in the shipyards, in the factories, in the assembly lines that still echo with Kaiser's conviction that there is no magic, only method. He taught a world at war that victory wasn't just about fighting harder, but building faster, smarter, and together. And when the steel cooled and the oceans calmed, his greatest legacy remained invisible. A transformed humanity, confident that no challenge, no matter how vast, was beyond the reach of organized effort. The war ended long ago. The ships are mostly gone. But the idea endures, forged in 5 days, built by thousands, and carried forever on the tide of history.